when we left off, we were talking about that old economic religion of mercantilism. Remember, mercantilism says that global wealth is a zero-sum game. There's only so much pie, and the more pie one person gets, the less is available to other people. That same goes for countries. And the more wealth one country gets, the less is available for others. Of course, we weren't talking about actual pie. We were talking about bullion, which is gold or silver. So mercantilists said states should pile up as much of this stuff as possible by doing two things. One, you maximize your exports, the stuff you sell to other countries. That way they get your stuff and you get their gold and silver. You also need to make sure that that flow of gold and silver is one way into your pockets by minimizing your imports. So you limit the stuff you buy from other countries. So you're not getting their stuff and they're not getting your gold. And that's how you want it. But how do you do that? Because it's quite possible that your own people might want to buy stuff from other countries. It might be cheaper from those other countries. We might think that what those other countries make is better. Well, you do that with tariffs. The name of the game is to be that weird word, autarky. And you want to be autarky, totally self-sufficient, selling stuff to the rest of the world. You manage that through tariffs. Tariffs can be taxes on the exports you sell to other countries, but tariffs are almost always taxes on imports from other countries. If we put a tariff on those things, we make them more expensive, and the country's consumers will probably buy something that's produced at home. One of the best examples of this is sugar. If, let's say, Rain, you want to become fabulously wealthy someday, you don't mind being bored, but you would like to be rich, you decide to be a commodities trader. Smith and Ricardo proposed a very different view of the world economy. Instead of seeing it as a zero-sum system, they argue that it could be positive sum, meaning that we can all get richer together if countries specialize in what they're good at producing and trade based on that comparative advantage. They make and export the things they're good at. They import and buy from other countries the things they're not as good at doing. And if we all do that, we all get richer. And with our kind of pie analogy, it's a bigger pie with bigger slices for all, and it's a pie that can continue to grow. For mercantilists, the pie was one size. It was always going to be that size. The only thing you could do was hope for a bigger piece. Another metaphor that fans of Smith and Ricardo like to use is the rising tide that lifts all boats. Right? It doesn't matter how big or small your boat is. It doesn't matter how fancy it is, how new or how old. If the tide rises a foot, both boats will be a foot higher than they were before. That's the idea. And free trade could create this. Again, states would specialize where they had a comparative advantage. This would make sure everything is more efficient. Countries are only doing what they're best at, what they can do for maybe the least amount of effort to produce the most amount of a product. To do this, you needed to get rid of those tariffs. Just remember, Adam Smith tells us, for the invisible hand of the market to work, everyone's actions have to be voluntary. If Alexis should buy, or maybe you start from scratch, your own soft drink manufacturing company, you don't really have a voluntary choice between using sugar or high fructose corn syrup to sweeten your drinks. If you try to use sugar, it's going to be so much more expensive than your competition that probably very few people are going to buy your drink. And so you have to go with high fructose corn syrup, even if you don't think it's as good. Right? Your trade decisions are not voluntary. If we can make them voluntary, then the invisible hand of the market can help us all get richer together. And that is both as producers and consumers of stuff. Because if we think about Alexis as a soft drink manufacturer, Alexis is a producer, producing those soft drinks for other people to buy, but Alexis is also a consumer, buying other people's labor, paying them to work in the factory, drive the trucks to distribute the drinks, consumer of water, the sweeteners, the other flavors, all of that stuff, right? We're all both.
Good afternoon, and pardon the interruption. I'm going to try to get a few makeup tests done in the freshman gym. If any of the following people are here, please send them to the freshman gym. Lele Sukon, Brennan Fisher, Mystery Croto, Layla Suas, Dylan Goins, Ethan Long, Aiden Boydston, Kaylee Wallace, Janessa Zuniga, Shai Miller, Dominic Titoni, Josue Tercio Ramirez, Rosa Montero Zamora, and Elam Gabbard. Any of those people are here.
Is that charger actually working, Jaden?
Yeah, Lele Sukon.
I'm just curious. I'm not trying to entrap you. Okay. Yeah, take it with you, man.
Okay.
When you go, seriously, I'd be glad to have it off my desk. Yep, you're welcome.
David Wallace, Janessa Zuniga, Shai Miller, Dominic Titoni,
Yes, Isaac.
Josue Tercio Ramirez,
Yes.
Rosa Montero Zamora.
Oh, wait. Gavin. That's who we're missing. When Gavin gets back.
Freshman gym for makeup EOC.
Once Gavin's back. There you go. As if economic ideas aren't confusing enough, we're now going to have to draw a distinction between two different visions of how globalization is supposed to work. And Smith and Ricardo are pushing for a very specific kind of globalization, one that only partially won out. They did not want empires, and they did not want colonialism. Adam Smith specifically spoke out against colonialism. This wasn't because he thought it was racist. This wasn't because he thought it was inhumane. He might have, but he argued against it on practical terms. He said, they're not worth it. They cost more to have and to keep than the value you get.
In your previous exercise, you analyzed Rudyard Kipling's 1899 poem, The White Man's Burden, in order to kind of prime your thinking for the Enlightenment idea we're going to consider today as an enabler of Globalization 1.0, which again was the globalization that occurred between 1800 and 1914. Before we jump into that, though, it's necessary for us to briefly step back to Smith and Ricardo and the type of globalization that was advocated by their ideas. And both logically and actually advocated by Smith, Ricardo, and people who agreed with them, and that was that we should have globalization by free trade. Right? Specifically not by building empires and collecting colonies. Smith specifically and explicitly spoke out against colonialism, saying really, in essence, that colonies cost more than they are worth. His was not an argument of the heart against imperialism and colonialism so much as an economic argument. It simply cost more to maintain and keep control of colonies, right, to suppress rebellions, than the value of what those colonies could produce. And we see plenty of instances. This painting here depicts the Indian Mutiny in the middle of the 19th century that was costly for Britain to put down. We see here the Mau Mau uprising in Kenya in the mid-1950s, which also was very costly for Britain to put down. And then we see the French effort to hold on to their colony of what is now Algeria, right, which was costly, as we should remember, in both terms of money, but also in the lives of the colonial power, British, French, the list could go on and on. Smith argued instead, of course, for free trade, and in his mind, this should be free trade among independent states. Because remember, for Adam Smith, what is important is that trade, economic relationships, our agreements with one another are voluntary. He saw this as an easier and cheaper way of getting what you want. Don't take it by force. Buy it. Right? Trade for it with independent states and between independent states. So if not the Enlightenment ideas of Ricardo and Smith, what ideas did support globalization by imperialism and colonialism? Well, the answer is the enabling Enlightenment idea C, which I have termed for our purposes the white man's burden. And we can see this as kind of the dark side of the Enlightenment. And I realize that the term Enlightenment is in that sense misleading. So remember, as I explained earlier, Rudyard Kipling's poem, The White Man's Burden, is not written until 1899, which is after the Enlightenment. But the ideas in his poem have their roots much farther in history, in the Enlightenment thinkers and in the Enlightenment era. And the thinker that we'll reference specifically is Immanuel Kant, a German philosopher of the Enlightenment, and as well as those who built on Enlightenment ideas such as his. And for our example here, we will use John Stuart Mill, who, again, is writing after the Enlightenment, but is very much influenced by its ideas. So what did Kant and Stuart and Mill have to say about this? Well, Kant, in his 1798 book on anthropology, wrote a couple of things. One, he said, humanity exists in its greatest perfection in the white race. The yellow Indians have a smaller amount of talent, the Negroes are lower, and the lowest are a part of the American peoples. And he would be talking here about the indigenous peoples of the Americas. To make it more clear, and in referencing to something that he heard or a conversation with a black man, he said, "This fellow was quite black from head to foot, a clear proof that what he said was stupid." And so he's judging the man and his intellect based on the color of his skin and judging it by the fact that it's not white. Mill, not writing in 1798, should be in the 19th century. Despotism is a legitimate mode of government in dealing with barbarians, provided the end be their improvement. Barbarians, he is certainly using here pejoratively. These are people who lack civilization. And when dealing with people who lack civilization, despotism is a legitimate mode of government for dealing with them. And despotism, as defined by the Oxford English definition, which we can take as giving us an understanding of despotism that would have been familiar to Mill because I don't want to put words into Mill's mouth or meaning that he is not expressing, but despotism is the exercise of absolute power, especially in a cruel and oppressive way. So Mill is saying this kind of rule is legitimate when dealing with uncivilized people. Okay. And as you correct your notes, again, sorry for this typo in the presentation, for Mill, the date you need is 1859. So again, writing quite a while after Kant, but not that far. And we certainly should link both of their ideas to the Enlightenment. These beliefs in the superiority, on the one hand, of white Europeans as a race, but also Western, and by Western we mean European civilization, the civilization of Western Europe, the United States, Canada, Australia, New Zealand. The belief in the superiority of these two things worked hand in hand to provide a rationale or justification for European states building tremendously vast empires of many, many colonies. Europeans and, as we'll see, the U.S. claimed that they were acting in ways meant to help, to bring benefit to the inferior peoples that they would conquer and then rule over. For example, at the time he said it, he was future U.S. president. He's, of course, actually been dead for quite a long time now and is a former president. But William Howard Taft said that our little brown brothers, and here he's referring to the people of the Philippines depicted in this political cartoon, right, that our little brown brothers would need 50 or 100 years of close supervision to develop anything resembling Anglo-Saxon. And by Anglo-Saxon, he means white British people and those descended from white British people, like the Americans. Anything resembling Anglo-Saxon political principles and skills. And so we were going to need to look after our Filipino little brown brothers for half a century or perhaps an entire century in order to help them get even close to our level of civilization. Not a flattering depiction of the Filipino people. And as you saw